Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Easy Conversations, a podcast about having easy conversations. I'm your host, Furkan Dandia. In this week's episode, I sit down with Richard Dolan, who's a therapist based in the UK. Rich and I touch on a lot of topics that are quite relevant right now, especially in this pandemic world. We talk about being parents, divorce, mental health in general, but even from just the lockdowns and social media and how social media contributes to a lot of the mental health issues we see. I hope you can get a lot out of this episode because I did. And if you could leave a review at the end, I would truly appreciate it.
All right, Rich. Welcome to the podcast. Thank you for reaching out and taking the time to come on here and have this conversation with me. Super grateful, and I've been I've been really amazed by how we've connected and some of the
Mm.
conversations we already have had. So this is not our first time chatting, and I feel like we have a lot in common. So that's again super. It's amazing for me personally. But yeah, I wanted to take the opportunity first, if you could introduce yourself and yeah, and then we'll just get right into it.
Sure. Yeah, and thank you for having me on. It is kind of crazy how we've connected over the past few weeks, and interesting talking to people about Instagram and social media being a kind of a negative thing. But what I've found is that I've made some really good connections like yourself. So there's a lot of opportunity there. Um, so my name is Richard Dolan. I'm in the UK. I'm a therapist in private practice. One of the things that really kind of stood out when I saw your page was the podcast you were doing, and I think I said to you I was having trouble sleeping the other night, so I kind of found myself sat in the dark in my kitchen with a hot drink the other night, and I listened to it, and it was the one about divorce, and that really resonated with me because I've been through that myself, and I just thought, whoa, this is someone that's having these conversations that I don't feel are happening enough, or are um, they're not kind of endorsed by celebrities or personalities. So we're not hearing them, but it was something I felt that I might be able to add some value to, and kind of reflected on my story and my journey. So
Hmm.
I literally tapped out a stream of consciousness email to you about how I've kind of got here, and I guess the whole journey has brought me to this point of understanding who I am, and I'm seeing that in a lot of people I know, maybe what's happening at the moment around the world, the pandemic. There's an awful lot of introspection, and self-reflection, particularly amongst men, particularly amongst men in my sort of generation, my age. I'm 43,
Hmm.
and it's a strange time to be a man and to be a middle-aged man for sure.
Hmm. Yeah, no, I appreciate that, and I think one of the biggest reasons why we've been able to connect and have these discussions is because we're probably, again, same age group, kind of the same, I would say, you come to these realizations in life, right? And unless you've been there, it's hard to explain. And there's several things
Absolutely.
I wanted to like tap into with you today, and we'll definitely get to the pandemic. But one of the biggest things, at least I saw in your post, and one of your posts I wanted to get into is coming to that point in your life where you finally decide to choose yourself, and all along you've been like, you feel like, okay, I've been doing what I've been told to do, or what I've been raised as, okay, this is what everyone does. And
Mm.
then you kind of come to that, it's almost like this, and I'm basically explaining what happened to me as well, but you come to this point in your life where you're like, what am I doing? Like, whose life am I living? Am I
Yeah,
living my own life, or am I living someone else's idea of what life should be? and
absolutely. Yeah.
and I feel like you made that comment in your post with, being a zombie in a movie, but being able to take those risks that you may not have taken before. And I think for you as well, the catalyst was going through a divorce and recognizing that, living authentically means making those difficult choices.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that was, the thing that kind of stood out to me about the episode of yours that I was listening to, and that question about whose life am I living? Is it my life? Is it the life of the expectations of society or my parents or whatever? I think we're asking that of ourselves much more openly and readily now. Our attitudes to questioning our mental health are much more open now, and I think a lot of people are kind of stopping in their tracks and thinking, whoa, what's happening? Whereas before, previous generations, we did, as you say, kind of do what was expected of us. We didn't really think about it too much. So I think my journey to choosing myself, as you say, started a long, long time before I realized it. And it probably happened around about the time of my parents' divorce. And, the impact that had on the way my life went over the next sort of 10 years or so. It's only in recent years and through my own sort of therapy and journey to become a therapist that I've understood what happened there. But I just kind of, I was just kind of going through the motions. I didn't really have, a goal or a plan. I bought a property very early out of necessity. And it was at a time when the property market was crazy in the UK, so they were kind of giving away mortgages. It's inconceivable to think of how easy it was to get a mortgage in
Yeah.
comparison to now. And I remember actually, and this is something I'm going to talk about on Instagram at some point, but I had a huge sense of imposter syndrome, because all of a sudden I'd gone from, being a kind of an 18, 19-year-old, and I was just 21, and all of a sudden I had my own, my flat or apartment, as you would call it. And I had this fear that I was going to get a phone call or a knock at the door any minute with somebody saying that they'd made a mistake with the paperwork, and I had to, get my stuff and go, because it just felt like this huge, like, responsibility that I didn't feel worthy of. So I was just kind of, working to live and going through the motions and condensing, many years into a few sentences here. It kind of fell into the routine of, okay, met somebody. Yeah, it wasn't great, but it kind of worked. I didn't realize at the time, but I had issues around my own self-worth, and
Mm-hmm.
that influenced sort of what happened in the relationship. And yeah, you just kind of do what's expected of you. You've been together X number of years. Okay, when you're getting married, are you going to have kids, buy a house? So that kind of carried on until everything sort of came crashing down, partly through who I was, and who I was trying to be, and
Mm-hmm.
the same for her as well. I was seeing it happen all around me, and that point, which led to me being the zombie in the film. And for people listening, that was actually a real thing. It's not a kind of a metaphor. I was actually a zombie in the film, and it was a really kind of random experience, but it was such a spontaneous thing that it stopped me in my tracks and made me think, what am I doing with my life? Why am I not living the life that I want to live? And how long have I been like living this idea of a life that isn't actually bringing me any joy or happiness?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and
And
and yeah, that was the point. Everything changed.
yeah, no, I appreciate that. I think obviously people can't see, but I have like this big smile on my face because I, because everything you're mentioning, Rich, I feel like I can pretty much align with, because I've went through a very, very similar
Mm,
journey. Like I finished school, I moved across the country for work and bought my property because that's what everyone was doing at the time.
yeah.
Met someone, decided to get married. Same thing. Like it just didn't feel like, okay, because again, you watch movies and you have this ideology of what love is, what a relationship is. And this is
Yeah.
not like any knock on who I was with or myself. It's just, it didn't feel like, it didn't feel right. But in the moment, it was like, well, this is what I'm meant to do. I'm supposed to get married and
Yeah.
I'm supposed to have a family.
Yeah.
And
You're supposed to do it, and you don't really question it because we grew up not questioning it.
yeah, yeah. But at the same time, when you look at it from another lens, it wasn't role modeled for us, right?
No, no. Well, what was modeled was to kind of project what you wanted, or um, to be grateful for what you had.
Mm-hmm.
To accept your lot, to not, I guess today's kind of way of describing it would be to stay in your lane. Just
Mm-hmm.
kind of, don't, where you come from dictated where you went.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, there was definitely a modeling from our parents, and they had it from their parents too, but it didn't promote the idea that there was something more, or that you could aspire to something more, or that the concept of choosing yourself. Just, I don't remember anything like that growing up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know. I remember having those conversations with my parents, and they're like, no, there's no such thing as choosing yourself.
Mm.
We never chose ourselves. We worked hard. You know, like, my mom was stay at home. My dad was the one working, paying the bills. He's like, we did everything for our kids.
Mm.
And it was almost like this expectation was passed down that you're gonna do everything for your kids.
Yeah.
And I remember having that kind of, again, realization at one point where I'm like, how am I role modeling for my son? Am I
Mm.
role modeling that you just have to, like, you know, you're not happy in life, but you just stick it out because that's what
Yeah.
you're expected to do? Or you choose your happiness? Because I didn't have that courage earlier in my life until I went through that whole journey of
Mm.
self-realization, and kind of the same thing as you, going through the motions, starting to learn about psychology, and now trying to become a therapist in the future. So I think for me, it's very similar, kind of the
Mm.
journey we've been on. But yeah, yeah, I think for me, it was also important to be able to role model that for my son. And
Yeah, I hear what you're saying, and as a parent now to two young girls, 5 and 10, I consider that to be my biggest responsibility. I mean, yeah, as I say, I'm a therapist, and I've worked within health and care for nearly 15 years now in various roles. Take it very seriously, very passionate about it, and it is where I'm meant to be professionally.
mhm,
But all of that comes second to the responsibility that I have to my family and to my daughters. And it is hard to know what the right thing to do is, what the right behaviors are to model, because the world is changing so fast. And I didn't learn any of this from my parents, because what they taught me has no real bearing
mhm,
on the world the way it is today. To be fair to them, the right values were there. I consider that I grew up with the right values,
mhm.
and I didn't really ever have to. I grew up with a lot of privilege. There's no doubt about that. Um, there was a lot of pain. There was a lot of heartache. There were difficult times, and we certainly, didn't have a fantastically easy life. But by comparison, yeah, I have to be honest. There was, privilege there. But what you just talked about, that whole kind of not choosing yourself, or the idea that happiness was a commodity that you didn't aspire to. Yeah, it wasn't ever kind of talked about in a way of the way that I feel we're encouraged or expected to do as parents today.
Mhm,
There's almost a judgment that comes
mhm.
uh, upon you as a parent if you are not going out of your way to empower your kids to be whatever it is that they want to be. So it's kind of flipped
Yeah.
completely the other way now.
Well, it's funny because before we move on, one last thing I want to touch on this subject though is, from, like, our parents' generation, when they see us, again, there's another form of judgment that they pass on, and it's, I mean, my parents don't say it, and I don't think they feel it anymore. But at one point, I could feel like, they almost felt like I was being entitled or selfish for choosing, for
Yeah.
having this concept of choosing myself. And for them, it was almost like, what do you mean you're choosing yourself? We didn't choose ourselves. We did everything for the family.
Yeah.
So you not only have that pressure of being a parent yourself, and empowering your children, you also have this judgment that's being passed on to you,
Mm.
in a way, by society. Like, I think the there is that shame that comes with divorce, even now, as common as it is. There's still that stigma attached to divorce, right?
Oh
And
yeah, it's a ugly word. The connotations, for sure.
yeah, yeah, but it's not, you know, it's such a conflicting message, because everywhere you hear for success, everyone's like, well, you've got to fail. If you don't fail, you're not going to learn. And through failure is how you appreciate your successes. But then when the subject of divorce comes up, it's like, well, no. It's a completely different lens
Yeah.
on it. Meanwhile, you can't look at it as a learning experience, just like everything else.
Yeah, that's a really good point, actually. I think it's almost like that's an exception to this idea that
Yep.
failure is positive, And as you say, we hear about it a lot in sort of startup culture, fail hard, fail
Hmm.
fast. Every failure is a step closer to success, all these kind of things, which, yeah, you can look at it from one side and say, yeah, these are sort of positive um, kind of affirmations around the growth that you're experiencing. Um, you could look at it the other side and say, well, they're kind of ways to not fully own and be accountable for the
Yep.
choices you made that led to that failure. But yeah, but divorce, well, that's bad. That's bad. And I think because it relates to that kind of that tribal thing, that union.
Hmm.
It is about the creation of a family. And that's the thing that's never meant to fail.
Hmm.
Or to fail at having a family is almost like to fail at being a human in a way, because we're so
Hmm.
conditioned to see that unit, that family unit, or that tribe, if you like.
Hmm.
If you can't keep your tribe together, then what sort of human being are you?
Hmm. Hmm.
And I fully hear the shame that comes with that, and I felt that shame myself and carried it with me for many years around, not only having come from a divorced family, which was fairly rare. Certainly, I remember growing up, and sorry, I remember moving out of the home that I shared with my parents into the home that my brother and I moved with my mum, and there was a stigma. We were the only kind of single parent family in the street, and
Hmm.
I remember after a few months there was a knock at the door, and it was a lady from along the street. And back then, kids still played in the street,
Hmm.
and we all played together. And it was the mum of one of the other kids, and she came along. She knocked on the door, and she said. And I remember standing in the hallway and seeing this conversation happen. And my mum had never spoken to this woman in her
Hmm.
life, but she said, "I'm really sorry. I don't know what to do. My husband's left me, and he wants a divorce. What do I do?" And so it's kind of like this kind of, you know, this stigma that that's the divorced lady with the two kids that lives along the end of the street.
Yeah, she has
Uh,
experience.
yeah, and
Yeah.
that just seems so weird to think that even happened, because it's such a
Yeah.
commonplace thing. But yeah, I had the shame of kind of coming from that, and people at school being kind of critical of that or making those judgments. And then I had the shame of going through it myself. Not only had I come from that failure, as you say, but then I went on to live that failure when I ended up getting divorced myself.
Hmm.
Um, so yeah, it's a horrible thing.
Yeah. Yeah. No. And I think part of the work we can do is support people through it and normalize it, right? And I hope these conversations help. I guess there was another thing I wanted to touch, because you mentioned your two daughters, and
Mm,
what I find really fascinating about your story is, um, excuse me, is obviously you said you're not. You've told me you're not the biological father of your eldest, and I find that very noble. But at the same time, if I'm being perfectly honest, like I'm not sure for me, like how I would be able to parent two children, one being my own and one not being like biologically my own. And what I want to understand is like how you've been able to like set yourself up for success in that situation, and some of the things you've done um, to be able to manage that.
yeah, I think you're talking about that kind of unconditional love thing
Yes.
there,
Yeah.
really. And what I would say is that I'm probably the last person to be the judge of whether I'm doing it successfully or not. But it is definitely something that people have said to me, and I think just to put some context around that. So, after I'd been through this whole experience of my divorce and spent some years, I lost a lot in that process. Not just financially, but emotionally as well. It was
Hmm.
the there's a line out of a film, Fight Club, that really stayed with me, and it was, you're never free to do anything until you've lost everything, which is kind of a little bit dark, but that's sort of what happened, and in that I found a liberation, and
Mm.
I was able to kind of start again, not out of choice but out of necessity.
Mm-hmm.
So I had the choice to decide how I wanted things to be, and who I wanted to be.
Yeah.
So the choices that I made during that period, and the understanding that I came to about myself, I think is what enabled me to be lucky enough to meet my fiance, and and have the family I do now. But she had tragically lost her husband. They'd been married for many years, and they'd had my eldest, their first daughter, and he passed away from pancreatic cancer, which was, I can't even conceive of how terrible that must have been. So when when we met each other, she, there was a kind of a weird synergy around the timeline of my, and I'm not for a moment comparing the divorce to what she went through, but
Mm-hmm.
we'd both experienced loss, and we'd both been through the grieving process. So that kind of accelerated our understanding of who we were and what we wanted. So when we did meet, I think we were both at a point in our lives where we were clearer, we had, greater clarity um, about what the right thing for us was, and perhaps able to make those decisions a bit faster. So I was incredibly sensitive about the fact that she was a widow, and there was this very young girl involved. She was 2, and what I had come to realise at that time is that, meeting somebody again at this time in life, children were going to be a factor. And I'd always thought I didn't really want kids, or rather, I never thought I didn't want them, but I didn't want them either, if that made sense. It just hadn't really factored in. And what I
Mm-hmm.
realise now is a lot of that was about not wanting to replicate my own childhood experiences, and all that sort of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But I realized that there was a likelihood that I might meet somebody who had children, and I needed to kind of get my head around that and be prepared to accept that. And then when I obviously met my fiance, and I realized the sensitivity around that, I knew instantly that she was. It sounds like such a cliche, but I knew she was the one.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. And I recognized that if that was what I wanted, then it was going to require me to make some changes in myself, and accept things in a way which I think, a lot of people wouldn't necessarily want to do, because it meant that they had to put other people first. So I thought this little girl needs. It's not just about me and the mum. It's about, you know the child as well. She needs a dad. So if I want to have any shot of this working, I need to be prepared for that to maybe be me. You know,
Mm-hmm.
and luckily enough that happened. But what I experienced was coming into the hole that had been left by somebody who was, very much loved,
Mm-hmm.
and I experienced an awful lot of projection of that grief and that loss. And I could have been anybody. It didn't matter that it was me, but I
Right.
stepped into that position. So yeah, the first couple of years of that relationship were really challenging, because people move through the grieving process at different phases. There's no
Mm-hmm.
timeline on that. Um, so I think I really put my own feelings about this unconditional thing to one side, and it was tough, because from my now daughter's point of view, she didn't see me as anything particularly special. There wasn't that bond. So I just kind of had to like tell myself, don't expect anything back, don't want anything back. You owed nothing back. If this is what you want, you're just going to have to suck that up, and that's not about you.
Mm-hmm.
This is about modeling, as you said earlier, modeling the right behaviors, giving her what she needs. And over the years that bond has developed. But now that I have 2 daughters, I genuinely love them both as much, and I don't treat them any differently. And it is not something I've actually had to work hard at, and I think that's because it's the right thing, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really made me reflect on what unconditional love is, and I don't necessarily think it relates to that biological link. I think it genuinely is about what what it is to just truly love somebody, and to feel love for somebody, and accept them, and everything that comes with it,
Mm-hmm.
if
Mm-hmm.
that makes sense.
Yeah, no, and I again thank you for sharing all of that. I'm it's really admirable what you've done, and like, and the way you've simplified it. I think another thing you touched on was going through that process of loss. Um, it, I think that in itself, and I'm just speaking for myself, but it is very humbling, right? You go through that experience, and I was telling my parents recently too that I'm so grateful for going through that experience, as hard as it's been, and all the consequences that come from it. It's taught me so much about myself, but it's also humbled me.
Mm.
And I remember being in my 20s, or even like late 20s, early 30s, where I felt invincible. Like I
Yeah.
had the successful career, I had the house I had dreamed of, the car I wanted, I had a family, and it was like I have everything. And then when you go
Mhm.
through that process, it just humbles you. You're like, well, no, I didn't have everything, because I can lose it like this if I'm not grateful for it, or if I'm not modest about it, or if I'm not appreciative and stuff like that. And I think what I'm trying to get at is, when you go through that humbling process in your life, it just opens you up. And I think maybe for you, it was also, taking on this role of being a father all of a sudden, first time to a 2-year-old. You probably came in with a much, much different perspective than you would have had you not gone through the divorce.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think the key word that you just said there for me is appreciation. You never really appreciate what you've got until you've lost it, until you
Yeah.
don't have it anymore. And yeah, absolutely humbling. I think I look back on myself at certain times in my life, and it's difficult. It's hard to look back at that person. There's an arrogance about that person, that the folly of youth. We think we know everything. It is that kind of cliche, but the process of going through loss, and having to look in the mirror and recognize your part in it, and genuinely be accountable, be responsible, not these kind of twee affirmations that we see on social media. You are beautiful, you are loved. No,
Hmm.
sometimes we're not very nice. Sometimes we make mistakes, sometimes we treat people badly, and sometimes we get it wrong, and I get things wrong every day. you
Hmm.
know and one of the things that I really try hard to do now is apologize a lot to well,
Yeah.
I try not to apologize a lot, because that means I'm getting it wrong a lot, but I don't really remember my parents ever apologizing to me,
Yeah.
and I remember being left with and sorry mum, dad, if you hear this, I'm really not gunning for you guys, but I remember this kind of feeling of, but that's not fair. There was, that was wrong of you to say that or to do that. So I really try hard now with my kids to kind of be accountable for my own behaviour, and say, listen, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have shouted, or I shouldn't have said that, or what I meant was, because I want them to grow up knowing that that's actually there's a strength of character in being able to admit when you're wrong, and acknowledge that, and recognize when you're projecting onto other people.
Hmm.
Um, so
Yeah,
yeah.
and I think what it also does, and I see that with my son, is when you're, as a parent, you're accountable and you're willing to take ownership, it also gives them the courage to express themselves, because they
Mm,
know my parent is not going to be defensive or shut me out. And that's where, for me, growing up, because I didn't receive an apology or any ownership, I didn't have the courage to even express myself and be like, hey, mom or dad, you said this is how it made me feel. No,
mm-hmm.
that was never encouraged, because it was like, just suck it up. And again, like you said, I'm not picking on my parents. I'm just, they just didn't have those tools that we do now, or the awareness we do now. But by, again, modeling that behavior for our children, what it allows them to do is also be able to express themselves. And I've had this conversation many times with people that, especially as men, we grow up and we just bottle all those emotions. And if, like you said, if we're taking ownership and apologizing to our children, we're also giving them that autonomy and empowering them to be able to express themselves. And I've seen that with my son over the last 2 years. He's way more open to express himself and tell me when I've done something to mess up. And immediately I'm like, you know what? I'm sorry. I messed up, and I will do better next time.
Yeah, and I don't know what that's like for you, but I get that. My 5-year-old the other day, she she keeps me on my toes, and sometimes I'm like, whoa, who's the parent in this exchange, and I never really remember that happening. Like the other day, this is a slight diversion, but she was asking me, about being a therapist. What is it you do? So I was trying to explain that I help people to kind of explore how they feel, and understand why they feel that way. And if they don't feel very good, then try and find a way to help them to make themselves feel better. And she goes, so you can read their brains? And I said, well, yeah, kind of, I guess. And then she just kind of looked at me and just said, you can't read my brain. And like, this is a 5-year-old, and the way that she said it, I was just like, whoa, I don't think I can. You scare me. You've got this kind of self-awareness, and I see it in a lot of children these days. And I think that they don't take any crap. They know, they can spot inauthenticity a mile off, and they expect adults to be held to account, in a way that I certainly don't remember. And just quickly talking about the generational thing, it doesn't take that long to go back through my parents, their parents, my grandparents. They grew up, in the aftermath of World War II. And this pandemic that we're going through now is the biggest kind of global thing since World War II that has impacted people on such a scale. And I remember when this kind of happened back in March last year, the first few days of it, I remember I was in the kitchen. I vividly remember it. I was making a coffee, watching the news, and I thought to myself, my God, this is going to leave such a such a psychological imprint that is going to be felt for years and years to come. And that was before everything that's actually happened has happened. So I think we are on the cusp of psychological change on the scale of which we've never seen.
No, I agree. Yeah, I mean, like in March last year, like if I was being perfectly honest, I think most of us didn't think we'd still be here, almost a year later. We obviously we didn't know the timing, but the longer this has gone on, the impact is just growing, right? The significance of this is just much larger than we thought it would be. And one of the things you and I have talked about is how much, as much as we've focused on the health side of this pandemic and staying safe and isolating and minimizing the spread, we haven't really focused on the aftermath and the struggle people are seeing right now, whether it's depression, anxiety, all the mental health challenges that are surfacing, and there's still not a lot of conversation around it, right? Like I think people talk about it in their social circles, but it's not happening at a larger scale where there's been, okay, well, here's resources, here's funding, here's, go get therapy. I don't think that's happening at a larger scale.
No, and I would be interested to know more about how it's happening, where you are, for instance. But certainly here, it is very much part of the daily narrative. It's been politicized, really. So there's no getting away from the fact that mental health and mental health support is massively underfunded in this country, and it has been, a stick with which any government has been beaten for some time. And we've got the NHS, this wonderful institution that that looks like one thing to many people, but is actually something very, very different. The best way I could describe it would be, it's kind of like a franchise. It's not this one big thing that that is the same everywhere you go. It's not like the Four Seasons where the experience is consistent. It's like the Starbucks and we've all been to that Starbucks where they are bang on it. They make your coffee really quick. They don't get your name wrong. It's clean. The service is amazing. We've all been to the one where you kind of know that the standards are pretty low, or the execution of the role of the duties is pretty low. And the NHS is a bit like that in that, it's kind of all these different kind of different versions of it that are all kind of doing the same thing, but in different ways, and they're all sort of set up in competition with each other. And they are providing, the bulk of the mental health support, which is done largely through, cognitive behavioral therapy. The idea is so this is how it works. You're depressed, or if you're feeling that way, you go to your GP, you contact your GP. They will then put you on a waiting list for you to get a telephone assessment, which will probably take anywhere between 2 and 4 weeks maybe to get a telephone call. And off the back of that, you will then get put onto a waiting list for 6 sessions of CBT, maybe some talking therapy, but it's usually CBT because obviously it's very easy to measure the outcomes and say, oh, look, it's working. And in between that, you'll get offered, the first thing you get offered is antidepressants. Okay, so ignoring the fact that when people are at the point of saying, okay, I want to get some help, they've already been dealing with it for a long, long time. They're at that point of crisis. It's not like, oh, I think maybe in 6 months I'm going to get some therapy. It's, I need it now. So they're entering into a system which isn't meeting the need, which is why we're seeing a huge increase in private practice, as we have obviously seen in the US, which is not regulated over here. You've got different routes to qualification, different levels, and this is actually something that's a huge bone of contention at the moment in terms of how it's not so much regulated, but how the various membership bodies that represent different modalities are vying for power. And it looks as though some form of regulation is coming in the near future, but I think if you are going to regulate it, or if it's going to be regulated, then that has to be that almost creates the case for funding, which the government don't want to do. So there's an awful lot of qualified therapists of all different competencies that are having to work voluntarily in order to get the necessary hours to then apply for accreditation, and accreditation is seen as the gold standard for a lot of employers. So there's a huge exploitation of it, and in amongst it all, you've got ever-growing numbers of people that need support with their mental health, which we've seen explode over the last year because of the pressures of lockdown. And I'm certainly seeing a huge increase in people getting in touch where be it in the initial text or email or conversation, the subject of lockdown and the effects of it are the primary driver for what's led them to get in touch. It might be something they've been carrying for years, but lockdown has been that catalyst for people to to really just get to that point of crisis.
Yeah, I feel like most people on a day-to-day basis, I don't mean to generalize, but are able to get through because they've got all these distractions, right? Like going to work or going to the gym or going out with friends, going for a beer. But with the lockdown, it's almost like you've had to face the demons, right?
Yeah,
there's no escaping it. Yeah, you're not running away from it. And there's still some people who are struggling and they don't know that they need therapy. And then there's the population of people that know they need therapy, but they don't go because they're scared of it or scared of finding out answers or just can't afford it, right? And to your point, a lot of therapists here, if they're not registered or they don't get a lot of clients because clients can't claim it through insurance if it's not a registered psychologist. So there's a lot of systemic issues, and I'm hoping with this pandemic and all the conversations people are having that it starts coming to the surface that we need to do a much better job in this space of mental health, whether it's making it affordable or more widespread. Like I know where I live here in Calgary, there's tons and tons of therapists, but the question then becomes, is it affordable? And and if you're going to go for a cheaper option, you may not get the quality of therapy that you're seeking, right? So
yeah, that's absolutely true. And I think it's like anything, you get what you pay for, except that for the most part, I think people that choose to go into therapy do not do so because there's a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. It's a vocational choice. It's because they, for whatever reason, I mean, you've got people that get into it who are perhaps doing it for questionable reasons, perhaps doing it because they need to feel better about themselves, and the kind of the helping thing. me personally, my reasons for doing it, I started my training back in 2008. I know, sorry, 2007.
Hmm.
And then, life kind of got in the way. We talked about it at the beginning, that path, met somebody, got married, started going through the motions, lost sight of that spark that had, ignited and showed me there was something else out there. And over the last sort of 12 years or so, I've working my way through health and care. I've come back to the realization that actually this is what I'm meant to do, because it's just the way I work. From a therapeutic sense, that's looking through that lens is how the world has always made sense to me.
Hmm.
And I'm able to bring the most value to to people who need it whilst I'm alive. Is
Yeah.
that that's doing something that matters. But it's difficult for people to afford it, because a lot of people who perhaps need therapy are below the poverty line, and they are unable to just look on a directory or go online and have the again, we come back to that word of privilege to choose who they work with. So there are a lot of therapists out there that will work on sliding scales and work less. I have a set fee, but I will always look at the circumstances of the person, and if something they can't afford, I look at what can I do. I will always
Hmm.
create a degree of capacity to work with people, in an affordable way. But
Hmm.
as much as I want to do that, I still have to look at it from a commercial sense, in that this is my living. This is something that I'm not a charity, and that's where a lot of therapists are really angry at the moment, because um, it's kind of like the government are standing back with their arms folded and saying, well, you guys want to do it, you guys want to help people, go, we're not stopping you from helping people. And I think, just to bring this in, there is the emergency explosion, certainly on Instagram, of these kind of self-help, mental health tip things. There's a lot of good stuff out there, but there's also a lot of kind of quite ill-informed or ill-advised stuff.
Yeah.
But it's almost like, well, you guys are looking after yourselves.
Yeah.
We've been on Instagram, we've seen what you're doing,
Yeah.
you got it, tell yourself you love each other. And they're almost letting that kind of happen and grow, where we know that social media is really, really damaging. We know that it has the power to affect negatively as much as it does positively. Like,
Yeah.
we're talking right now because of social media,
Of course.
but we also know handfuls of people that have suffered as a
Yes.
result of social media. So
Yeah.
yeah, I think that they're kind of standing back and letting people look after themselves, and
Yeah.
it's just not good enough.
Yeah. No, I can't stop laughing here. I mean, everything you're saying is very serious, but I feel like you're almost like you're almost
But
reading my mind. You're directing the conversation where I want to go. And the
all right,
next
maybe
topic,
I can read your brain, like my daughter said.
yeah, you should tell your daughter that you're. So I did want to like interject earlier. So
Sure.
Starbucks never, well, I won't say never, but they seldom get my name right. So I'll put that out
Uh,
there for comedic
okay.
purposes. But yes, I think the social media thing that you've brought up is a perfect segue as we get to the end here. But you and I have almost, I would say, almost ranted about social media because we are, I think for us, we're trying to get a message across, right, around mental health, and there's an abundance of people who are also doing the same, and you know, it's social media, especially like, I think most of us are on Instagram right now. It's it's a catch 22 almost, right? Like there's a lot of value if you go seek it,
Mhm.
which we've talked about, being able to connect with people and having these conversations, amazing. Like I wouldn't have been able to do that otherwise. But there's also the image it creates for people, right? Like for if I go on social media and I'm having a rough day, I'm stuck at home, I'm whether I'm not happy with my job or just my living situation, and I go see someone's perfect life as they portrayed it on Instagram or Facebook or whatever, it does more damage
Mhm.
than benefits, right? And I think we've talked about that. Like, what are your thoughts? Like, what's your experience been, and do you find that with some of the clients you're working with? Like, how much of it that anxiety or just depression is driven because of social media.
Yeah, it's definitely a factor. Personally, I've never really used social media for myself. Um, I've used Twitter for work. I've never really done Facebook. I'm an introvert. I don't really like sharing, much about myself, which is quite ironic, seeing as I'm sat here talking to you about some, kind of personal stuff. But I guess this is stuff that matters to me. This is actually stuff that, I think hopefully some of the people listening to this might be able to relate to, or kind of, recognize that, it is happening in people's lives. But I've got absolutely no interest in sharing what I had for dinner, or making sure I get that perfect selfie to kind of look like I've got this amazing lifestyle. But I've started to use it as a therapist because I recognize that there is a huge platform there to connect with people who are going to social media looking for some sort of answers, some sort of guidance. So yeah, I'm using it from a commercial perspective, but what I've experienced is a lot of the clients I've worked with, as you said, have come with these these negative self-image challenges that have been perpetuated by what they see on social media. And
Mm-hmm.
the crazy thing is, a lot of people that I've worked with are aware of that. They're not,
Mm-hmm.
they know that what they're looking at is fake. But I think the perception of what somebody else's amazing life looks like is kind of compounded by this validation loop that we get locked in, and the dopamine hit.
Mm-hmm.
So we are it's like a legal crack. And this is a kind of a pandemic in itself. People are addicted to that dopamine hit, and it is in the palm of your hand. You carry it around with you. There's no shame in it. You don't have to go around the back of a building and take a hit off the crack pipe. You're on your phone the whole time, and
Mm-hmm.
it's not just it's not just Instagram. It's the way in which we communicate is becoming increasingly built on validation and acceptance.
Mm-hmm.
And going back to what we talked about at the beginning about bringing up two young girls, it doesn't really matter whether you're talking about girls or boys, but bringing up young children into a world which is increasingly becoming superficial, and the currency is something that's so disposable. If you haven't proved your worth or value by the metrics that are currently used to determine it within 15 seconds, you're at the bottom of the pile. I worry about how to counter that. As a
Mm-hmm.
parent from a generation that never had to deal with that. In fact,
Mm-hmm.
I posted something on Instagram the other day about what the world was like when I was 16 and where I was at, but I kind of can't even conceive of how challenging I would have found that world if we had the things that kids have to deal with today.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And yeah, it's
Yeah.
it's scary.
And part of the problem also, it becomes almost perpetual in the sense that because of the algorithms they have going on in the background, if you search for something negative, I mean, you can consider it negative. If I'm searching for the way someone looks and I feel less than because of the way people look a certain way, the algorithms are going to keep throwing that information at me, and it's just going to keep I'm going to keep sinking deeper and deeper and deeper without
Yeah.
even knowing what's going on,
Yep.
because it's just feeding that story or that message for me, and I'm just like, yeah, okay, here we go again, here we go again. And I think that's part of the problem is, even though people are maybe aware, they're sometimes they've gone so deep that they don't know how to get back out.
Absolutely, and you can apply that to any kind of addiction. If you look at alcoholism or any
Yep.
any drug addiction, very rarely do you come across an addict who isn't aware that they're an addict.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what we're dealing with. We're dealing with an addiction, but because much like, and the attitude to this has changed, in recent years with smoking and tobacco. That's now considered to be a negative thing, that we
Mm-hmm.
recognise that it's bad for us. We kind of laugh at how it used to be, recommended back in the sort of the 50s, but we know that that's kind of bad, and it is acceptable. It's an acceptable form of addiction because we're all in so deep now that we almost can't go back, because actually the world is built on on that, the level of connectivity that social media provides. The way in which we communicate now has irrevocably been changed, and it's hard to see how we can get out of this hole that we've dug ourselves. And then you have to ask the question, have we dug the hole, or has the hole been dug for us?
Yeah, no, I think, I mean, the analogy is great because you think about it, like there was a time when people would smoke on planes and in restaurants and in public, and now it's almost like, because of the changes we've experienced in society, it's almost like someone that smokes even outside, they feel shamed.
Oh yeah, totally. There's a really, really strong kind of element of shame with that.
Yeah, but with social media right now, it is scary. And again, yeah, you and I've talked about it. It's how do you find the positivity in it and get the value that it's meant to have without the negativity, or do you just accept it and find balance?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and not one that I'm sure I know the answer to. I mean, so my experience so far, and I know that we've talked about this, I'm certainly not immune to the dangers of it, and it's something I've had to be really mindful of, because you kind of used to hear those things, sort of thinking back to the 80s, about heroin. Oh, you only need to try it once to get addicted. All you need to do is post once or twice and get a few likes, and you are going to get that dopamine hit. You're going to get that validation. It feels good. You're being accepted. You are throwing your hat in the ring. You're shouting out to the tribe that we all belong to, and you're being allowed to get closer to the fire. And you wouldn't be human if you didn't experience some kind of thing. Obviously, I think it depends on you as an individual, and all of the things that we've talked about this evening, as to how important that is to you, but you will have a reaction. So you've got to be really careful. If you're gonna dip your toes in that water, you've got to be prepared, to swim against the current, because it will take you, where it wants you to go, unless you're strong enough to navigate it. And I think it's very easy for you to get into that water without any awareness of how strong that current is.
Yeah, and I think the things you mentioned around likes and follows, it's all validation, and at the end of the day, we as humans need validation, but it's being able to understand the superficial nature of it, and not letting it create this false sense of, I don't know, this false identity basically.
Yeah,
and I think most people fall into that trap because it's created this false sense of identity for them. It allows them to be someone else. It's almost like putting on a mask, right? And
absolutely,
it's detrimental to your relationships, your friendships, a lot of things, right? So
you're absolutely right. And I think the more that we wear that mask, the less time we spend being ourselves. And we do need validation as humans. The key, and this is where therapy, from my perspective, is really, really valuable, is that it can help you to validate yourself. If you can validate yourself, then you don't need it from somewhere else, which makes you immune to all the things that are trying to kind of get you hooked on that validation. So yeah, it all comes back to that self-acceptance, that self-actualization. And something that it's certainly been a theme in the content that I've posted, and it's something that I absolutely champion and advocate. And I remember just the other day I had a big conversation with my girls about this. Be yourself. You might not like yourself, but you can work on that. You can figure out why you don't, and you can work on that, and you can learn to like yourself. But when I started being myself, choosing myself, that's when my life changed for the better.
Yeah, and I think that's we can talk about this for hours. I think that the whole existential nature of accepting yourself and being comfortable in your skin, and unfortunately, it's not that easy.
No.
Obviously, if it was, people wouldn't be struggling, nor would they be caught in this whole loop of social media and seeking that acceptance or validation. So it is, it's a deep topic, and I think just bringing awareness to it is probably the best we can do at this
Absolutely. But
point.
just to make that point, you captured it perfectly earlier when you talked about that humbling experience. You know, that's where the growth is. You know,
Hmm.
that going through those experiences are where we learn about who we really are. And accepting yourself doesn't mean pretending that there's nothing bad about you. You know,
Hmm.
we are, none of us are perfect. There are all things that we've done, choices we've made that we would regret or we change. And accepting yourself is about, you know, the bad and the good, and that comes back to balance. And I think you talked about balance in relation to social media, and I think that applies to life. Really, you can't have good without bad.
Yeah, absolutely. And I, again, like I said, I'm grateful for going through that, because I'd rather be making mistakes every day and learning from them and improving, rather than living in a world where I feel like I'm not making mistakes.
Yeah,
It's not a good place to be.
yeah, there's a lesson in every mistake, and I think some people just keep making the same mistake until that lesson is, you know, is learned, you know.
Mhm. Exactly. Well, Rich, again, this has been a great conversation. Time flew by. I really enjoyed
I
it.
know, it's been a pleasure.
But for people that want to get a hold of you, or kind of follow your content, what's the best place to find you?
Yeah, so I kind of feel a bit dirty about saying this now that we've just been doing down social media, but I am out there. So you can check out my website. That's checkyourhead.co.uk, or get me on Instagram and Twitter. That's checkyourheaduk. So if you want to get a different perspective on mental health, have a look at some of the stuff I've put out there. I think there's definitely a message in it. If you want to have a look.
Yeah. Yeah. No, thanks again, Rich.
No, I appreciate it. Take care.
Well, that's the end of the episode. Thank you again for tuning in and showing your support. Until next week.